to my new channel, Mostly Murder. I'm hoping that many of those people who have subscribed or followed my channel, They Got Away with Murder, will find this one equally interesting, or more so. I'm certainly looking forward to covering a lot of the cases which I've been unable to cover in They Got Away with Murder by the restrictions that I placed on it in calling it They Got Away with Murder. I've been very careful in the choice of this title to allow myself as much latitude as possible. The case of Dr. William Palmer, or the trial of Dr. William Palmer, was regarded as being the most sensational trial of the Victorian period. Charles Dickens called Dr. Palmer the greatest villain that ever stood in the Old Bailey.
John Parsons Cook attended the Shrewsbury Handicap Races with his friend Dr. William Palmer on Tuesday the 13th of November 1855. Both men were avid betting men, addicted to the turf, and both men owned horses which were running in the main race. Although a medical doctor, William Palmer, who was 31, had abandoned this calling in favour of a life of gambling on the horses. He was now heavily in debt and gambling on credit. He had a stream of letters from creditors and writs issued against him for the recovery of these debts. He hoped a run of luck at Shrewsbury might turn his fortunes around. His hope was misplaced. Later that day the horse he owned, called Chicken, lost. His 28-year-old friend, John Parsons Cook, who was wealthy and had his own horse, Polestar, running at Shrewsbury, won around £2,000 in prize money and bets. That's approximately £300,000 in 2025 terms. He was in excellent spirits and had a small dinner party at the Railway Hotel in Shrewsbury, where he and Palmer were staying, and invited a few friends to celebrate his good fortune. The following day Palmer brought Cook a glass of brandy and water to his room, and at Palmer's intimation he quaffed the entire glass, save a small dreg, and immediately cried out, "Good God, there is something in it! It burns my throat!" His friend, Dr. Palmer, tasted the residue in the glass and declared, "There's nothing in it." He then commented to his sporting companions Ishmael Fisher and George Herring, who were also present, "Cook thinks there is something in the brandy and water." But John Parsons Cook became violently ill, and as his two friends, Herring and Fisher, helped him to bed, he said, "That damn Palmer has been dosing me." On the 15th of November, Palmer and Cook returned to Palmer's hometown of Rugeley in Staffordshire, and Cook, still a little shaky, took a room at the Talbot Arms, which was opposite Palmer's house. He made a good recovery over the next 2 days, and on the 17th of November he met with Palmer for a drink. This caused a sudden relapse, and he became violently sick again. William Palmer took good care of his friend. He was, after all, a doctor. Palmer was thoughtful enough to have a soup prepared for Cook, and sent it over to him at the Talbot Arms. A chambermaid there, Elizabeth Mills, took a sip of the soup and promptly fell ill. Cook consumed the rest of it, and his vomiting became even worse. The next day Palmer helpfully began collecting Cook's winning bets for him, amounting to some £1,200, about £65,000 in 2025 terms. He also purchased 3 grains of strychnine from Salt's chemist, which he said was to kill a dog, and the following day bought strychnine and prussic acid from a different chemist. On the 21st of November, not long after Palmer administered 2 pills to him at the Talbot Arms, Cook died in agony at about 1 in the morning. As he lay dying, he informed the chambermaid Elizabeth Mills that Palmer had poisoned him. William Palmer was born on the 6th of August 1824 in Rugeley, Staffordshire, the sixth of 8 children of Sarah and Joseph Palmer. His father, a wealthy timber merchant, died when William was aged 12, leaving Sarah with a fortune of £70,000. That's about £10 million in 2025. Palmer seems to have been a bright but wayward and deceitful child. He was witty and charming too. At 17 he was apprenticed to a Liverpool chemist, but was dismissed after just 3 months when a sum of money went missing, whose theft he was suspected of. He then studied medicine in London and qualified as a doctor at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in August 1846. He was now just 22 years old, and he returned to Staffordshire that year to practice medicine. A curious incident occurred soon after his return to Staffordshire. He struck up an acquaintanceship with a man called George Abley, and the two drank together at the Lamb and Flag pub in Little Haywood. Abley became ill, and later that evening he died in bed. There were suspicions concerning the matter, but nothing was ever proved. It was noted, however, that Palmer was pursuing Abley's attractive wife at the time. Palmer enjoyed the company of women, and it is believed that he had many illegitimate children over the years. Nevertheless, he began courting a woman called Anne Thornton, and on the 2nd of October 1847 they married at St. Nicholas Church, Abbots Bromley. His new mother-in-law, also called Anne Thornton, had been the mistress of a wealthy man, and after his death in 1834 she had inherited a fortune of £8,000, about £1 million in 2025. The mother-in-law came to stay with her daughter and new husband in early January 1849, and died just 2 weeks later, on the 18th of January. It seems she had lent Palmer a large sum of money. An elderly Dr. Bamford, consulting with Dr. Palmer, recorded a verdict of apoplexy as being her cause of death. Soon afterwards, always a chancer and obsessed with racehorsing, he handed over the reins of his medical practice to another man. He borrowed £600, about £100,000 today, from a man called Leonard Bladen, whom he had met at the races. Bladen expected a high return on his loan. Alas, he died in agony at Palmer's house on the 10th of May, 1850, apparently of an abscess of the pelvis. It surprised his wife to find that Bladen died with little money on him, because he had recently won a large sum at the races. His betting books were also, curiously, missing. It meant there was no evidence of his having lent Palmer any money at all. The slate was, happily for Palmer, wiped clean. It seemed peculiar to some that those associated with Palmer, and whom he was in debt to, or stood to gain from, lived short lives. Although his wife had given birth to a son, William Brooks Palmer, in late 1848, he was the only one of Palmer's children to survive. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer had 4 other children, all of whom died in infancy. Elizabeth Palmer died at the age of 10 weeks in 1851. Henry Palmer died aged 1 month in 1852. Frank Palmer died in 1852 also, just a few hours after his birth. And John Palmer died on the 27th of January 1854. He was 3 days old at the time. Infant death was not uncommon at this time, so these deaths were not regarded as anything more than a terrible misfortune, though this view was to change with subsequent events. It was thought he had poisoned them to avoid the expense and inconvenience of maintaining them. By 1852, Palmer's career as a gambler was not going well. He was heavily in debt, and it got much worse. He resorted to forging his wealthy mother's signature to raise credit, using a fixer in London called Thomas Pratt for this purpose. The interest on these loans was high, 60%, and repayments had to be made with alarming frequency. Like all gamblers, he sought to offset his losses by doubling down on his bets. He bought 2 racehorses, Nettle and Chicken, for £4,000, about £750,000 in 2025. He hoped these would recover his losses. They didn't. By 1854 his situation was dire. His creditors were snapping at his heels like a pack of angry dogs, and threats of legal action were being made against him, and then to his mother, who was acting, quite unwittingly, as his guarantor. He bribed the postmaster of Rugeley, Samuel Cheshire, to intercept letters to his mother. He was most anxious his fraud should not be uncovered either by her or by the authorities. The latter would inevitably lead to a lengthy prison term. But needs drive the devil, and Palmer had a busy mind. That same year, in 1854, he took out life insurance on his wife Anne with the Prince of Wales Insurance Company, and paid out a premium of £750 for the policy. £100,000 today, although this was an enormous premium for a man in his financial position to pay. The payoff, should his wife die, was considerable. Her death would net him £13,000, £1.8 million in 2025. This proved to be a sound bet, as it turned out, because Anne Palmer died soon afterwards on the 29th of September, 1854. She was just 27 years old. She was in good health, but there was a cholera pandemic in Britain at the time, so it was assumed she had fallen victim to this malady. It seems Palmer had got lucky again. Although the payout was substantial, Palmer's debts were of a magnitude that when he had settled the most pressing claims of his creditors, he was still heavily in debt, with 2 creditors owed around £23,000, about £3.25 million in 2025 terms. They issued writs against his mother, who was still blissfully unaware that she was unwitting guarantor to his loans, but Palmer managed to intercept these with the help of the obliging postmaster Samuel Cheshire. His creditors had not gone away, though. He knew this. He decided to cast his net more widely, as his immediate family was becoming depleted. He attempted to take out life insurance on his brother, Walter, for the enormous sum of £84,000, £12 million in 2025, but no company was willing to undertake the risk. Eventually he settled on the Prince of Wales Insurance Company for a more modest policy of £14,000, £2 million in 2025. Again, it required the payment of a large premium, but clearly seemed a bet worth taking to him. His brother Walter was a drunk and reliant on his brother, and William proved generous to a fault, supplying him with as much liquor as he could drink. Walter died on the 16th of August, 1855. It was timely. William's debts were mounting, and unable to make repayments, it was only a matter of time before his fraud was exposed. Palmer now hurriedly put in a claim for the life insurance on Walter, but the insurance company, feeling that Palmer was benefiting rather too handsomely from the deaths of his relatives, dispatched ex-detective inspectors Simpson and Field to investigate the circumstances of his claim. It was learned that Palmer had also been attempting to take out £10,000, £1.5 million today, on the life of George Bate, his stable manager. They found that Bate had been persuaded, under some duress by Palmer, to have his life insured. But this insurance application, which grossly exaggerated Bates' situation and worth, had been refused. Fortunately, perhaps, for Bates. Inspectors Field and Simpson recommended that the life insurance on Palmer's brother, Walter, should not be paid, and further inquiry should be made into his death. This was an unpleasant development for Palmer. At this time, Palmer was involved with his housemaid, Eliza Tharm, and on the 26th of June 1855 she gave birth to Alfred, Palmer's illegitimate son. It was more unwelcome news for Palmer, but its perfect remedy appeared in mid-November, when Alfred died of convulsions. He was buried, coincidentally, on the 21st of November, the same day that John Parsons Cook died. The death of his friend, John Parsons Cook, had presented Palmer with new opportunities. Although he had been absolutely broke on his return from Shrewsbury races, he had collected Cook's Shrewsbury winnings for him, which ran to several thousands of pounds in total, and he now began making repayments on his loans. Then on the 23rd of November, William Stevens, Cook's stepfather, arrived in Rugeley to clear up his stepson's affairs. With typical effrontery, Palmer informed him that young Cook owed him £4,000, or £750,000 in 2025. At this time he tried to persuade the obliging postmaster Samuel Cheshire to witness a note he had drawn up, which bore Cook's signature, acknowledging that he owed Palmer £4,000. This time Cheshire refused to oblige him. It must reasonably be assumed Palmer had forged Cook's signature himself. William Stevens asked a friend of his stepson Cook's to fetch the papers and betting books from Cook's room. The man went for these, but returned empty-handed. They were missing. It was established that they had been seen in Cook's room earlier that day, and immediately following Cook's death, Palmer had been seen searching the dead man's pockets and leaving the room with a collection of papers. Stevens was becoming suspicious by degrees, and demanded that the room be locked and no one permitted to enter without his being present. Palmer shrugged this off, informing Stevens that the betting books were of no use now in any case, since all debts were cancelled once a gambler died. Stevens brushed this aside, and he requested a post-mortem be held. Palmer had already obtained a death certificate from 86-year-old Dr. Bamford, which gave the cause of death, at Palmer's suggestion, as apoplexy. The post-mortem examination of Cook's body took place at the Talbot Arms on the 26th of November, and was carried out by medical student Charles Devonshire and chemist's assistant Charles Newton, overseen by a Dr. Harland, and in the presence of Palmer himself. Throughout, Palmer interfered with the examination, bumping into Newton, and taking away the stomach contents, which had been placed in a jar sealed with parchment. A furious Dr. Harland suddenly noticed the jar was missing, and demanded its return. "It should not have been disturbed," he said. Palmer returned the jar to Harland. It was then noted that 2 slits in the parchment top appeared to have been made, possibly by a penknife. The jar was to be taken to Guy's Hospital in London by carriage, and Palmer tried to persuade the postboy to upset the carriage and accidentally break the jar. The postboy refused. When the jar arrived at Guy's Hospital, it was examined by Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor, the foremost toxicologist of his day. He found the contents to be in such poor condition that they were useless. As a result, a second post-mortem took place on the 29th of November, and tissue samples were taken and sent to Dr. Taylor for examination. Although he found evidence of antimony, he found no strychnine, but stated that it was his belief that Cook had been poisoned by strychnine. The description of Cook's agonizing illness left little room for doubt. His feet were distorted, his back arched, but no significant signs of injury or illness to any of his organs could be detected. These were the characteristic symptoms of strychnine poisoning. The Rugeley postmaster, Samuel Cheshire, now further obliged Palmer, who was playing a rearguard action of his own, by intercepting letters addressed to the coroner William Ward. Cheshire was later jailed for 2 years for this offence. Palmer also wrote to the coroner himself, requesting that the verdict of death be given as natural causes. enclosing in his letter a £10 note. £1,400 in 2025 terms. The stunned coroner declined the bribe. The inquest into the death of John Parson Cook was duly held at Rugeley Town Hall in early December. The town was alive with rumours about Palmer and his exploits. He didn't attend. The circumstances of Cook's death were given, and the evidence of the medical men was heard. And on the 15th of December the jury delivered its verdict, stating that the deceased died of poison wilfully administered to him by William Palmer. That same day William Palmer was arrested by Chief Superintendent Daniel Bergen on the orders of the Chief Constable and charged with murder and forgery. He was taken in custody and held at Stafford Jail. He was angry, threatened to go on hunger strike, but eventually relented. The arrest of Palmer for murder and the suspicions in respect of the deaths of many others created a sensation in Staffordshire. The newspapers pored over the life of Palmer, real and imagined. Accounts were published in pamphlets which circulated widely in Staffordshire and beyond, and it quickly became obvious to the authorities that there would be little chance of a fair trial being held in Staffordshire. Everyone knew the evidence and more besides. The decision was therefore taken to remove the trial to the Central Criminal Court in London, far from the madding crowd. It took an Act of Parliament to accomplish this, the Central Criminal Court Act, 1856, popularly known as Palmer's Act. It has been suggested that the true intention in moving the trial to London was because it was feared Palmer was popular and might be acquitted at Stafford Assizes. That seems unlikely. After all, the inquest jury had little difficulty in naming him as the murderer of Cook. It may have been feared, though, that a local jury could have been influenced by Palmer's wealthy mother and family, and it escaped no one's attention that Palmer, a wheedling and cunning man, had persuaded Postmaster Samuel Cheshire to intercept letters from his creditors to his mother, and letters from the public to the coroner, and that he had tried to persuade the postboy to break the jar containing the stomach samples of Cook. He had even attempted to bribe the coroner to deliver a verdict of death from natural causes for Cook. There were many reasons for holding the trial outside of Staffordshire. It was obvious that many of the deaths of those close to Palmer were, to say the least, suspicious, and so the Home Secretary ordered the exhumation of the bodies of his wife Anne and brother Walter for examination. It was now too late to examine the body of Anne's mother, who had been buried 6 years previously. In fact, it was found that even Walter's was too badly decomposed to yield any meaningful result, though Dr. Taylor did find antimony in all of Anne's organs. The trial of William Palmer began on the 14th of May, 1856, at the Old Bailey before the Lord Chief Justice John Campbell, sitting with Mr. Justice Cresswell and Baron Alderson. The Attorney-General, Alexander Cockburn, led for the Crown, assisted by Edwin James, Q.C., and John Walter Huddleston. The defence was led by Mr. Sergeant Shee. Large crowds gathered outside the halls of justice, and the great and good were out in force to see the spectacle. Lord Lucan, fresh from Balaclava, was in the gallery. His great-great-grandson would famously avoid his own appointment with the Old Bailey 120 years later. The case for the Crown was damning, but circumstantial. Murder cases almost always were circumstantial before science and forensics were sufficiently developed to radically alter the standard for evidence. The prosecution case was that 1. Palmer was facing ruin. The death of Cook offered the means to cancelling his debts to Cook, and also of acquiring his winnings from Shrewsbury races, and his horse Polestar. Though not evidence as such, it did provide a compelling motive. 2. Palmer had been seen removing papers from Cook's room following his death, which suggested the missing betting book and other financial papers were in his possession. He commenced repaying his debts immediately following Cook's death, which confirmed the force and urgency of the motive. 3. Cook had become ill following visits by Palmer, in which Palmer had opportunity to interfere with his food or drink, or administer what was purported to be medicine. 4. The soup Palmer supplied to Cook had been tried by the chambermaid, and she had suffered identical symptoms to Cook. 5. Palmer had attempted to frustrate the post-mortem and examination of the stomach contents, indicating his fear of what might be discovered. 6. The symptoms exhibited by Cook were agreed by medical experts to be those of strychnine poisoning. 7. Cook himself expressed his belief to 3 people that Palmer had poisoned him. 8. An associate of Palmer's saw him examining a glass of brandy against the gaslight at the hotel in Shrewsbury directly before going to Cook's room and giving it to him, which precipitated his first violent illness. 9. Palmer bought 3 grains of strychnine 2 days prior to Cook's death, and then 6 grains from a separate chemist, and attempted to conceal the second purchase from the first chemist, who happened to enter the shop at the time of this transaction. He also bought prussic acid. No satisfactory account could be given for these. 10. Palmer attempted to bribe the coroner and others to secure a benign result concerning the cause of Cook's death. His motive here was plainly to avoid blame for his death. Throughout the proceedings, William Palmer was calm but attentive, according to observers, and constantly scribbled notes which he passed to his counsel. The defence argued that no poison had been found, that Palmer's taking advantage of the circumstances and possessing opportunity and motive was hardly enough for a conviction. Cook had visited doctors for throat problems, which may have been the true cause of his death. His health was indifferent at best. A large number of medical witnesses doubted the diagnosis of strychnine poisoning, chiefly because it had not been discovered in the stomach contents. It would probably have been enough today, in the absence of other forensic evidence which we have come to expect, to acquit William Palmer. In 1856 it was not. Lord Campbell summed up in a fashion which was hostile towards Palmer. Nevertheless, Palmer's last note, passed to his counsel during a break in the judge's charge to the jury, read, "I think they'll find a verdict of not guilty." He was wrong again. The judge concluded his summation in a tremulous voice, almost inaudible, by saying, "Gentlemen, I must now dismiss you to consider your verdict, and may God direct you." It was the 27th of May, 1856. The jury retired and returned after an absence of an hour and 17 minutes. Their verdict, delivered by their foreman, came to a hushed court and an implacable William Palmer as guilty. Palmer, phlegmatic to the end, expressed his view of the conduct of the prosecution with an apt racing metaphor. "It was the riding that did it," he said. It had been, on so many levels. Lord Campbell adopted the black cap, and in the gravest of tones passed sentence of death upon William Palmer. Palmer was returned from London to Stafford Prison, and it was here, outside the gates, on a temporary scaffold before a crowd of some 30,000 people, that he was publicly hanged on the 14th of June, 1856. As he stepped onto the gallows, Palmer is said to have looked at the trapdoor dubiously and quipped, "Are you sure this is safe?" Palmer's motivation for killing was clear enough. He killed not from malice or any sense of animosity towards his victim, but merely to remove inconveniences, sometimes serious ones, but often minor ones. His murder of George Abley was simply because he fancied George's wife. It seems incredible that murder could be the chosen remedy for such a whim. But what made Palmer so unique as a murderer was that he held human life in the smallest regard. By the time he killed John Parsons Cook, he was facing serious public ruin, disgrace, and a lengthy prison term. He bore no animosity towards John Cook. He was his friend. But his death offered a practical solution to Palmer's pressing difficulties. He had to be removed. Palmer had no empathy whatsoever. He regarded the yardsticks of right and wrong as personal inconveniences to himself, no more. They had no personal value to him. That was embedded in his nature, probably a quirk of genetics, perhaps hardened by seeing a great deal of death from an early age. It was an age in which death was often untimely. It may have bred in him an indifference to death. Its random distributive power amongst the population often had something of the gambler's fortune about it. Palmer was a rogue all his life, a thief, a womanizer, but he was also witty and good company, it seems. It was a strange mixture in his character, and a dangerous one. He quit medicine to indulge himself in a world of chance. Horse racing, he believed it was a better predictor of success in life than moral or even conventional societal values. After all, to remove people from his path by killing them was no worse than the caprice with which fate might strike any one of them down with cholera or apoplexy or some other affliction in a moment. Before being led out to the scaffold, the governor asked Palmer if he wished to make his peace before God by confessing to his crimes. Palmer considered the matter and said, "Cook did not die from strychnine poisoning." "Good God, man, this is not a time for quibbling. Did you or did you not kill Cook?" exclaimed the governor. Palmer paused before replying further. The Lord Chief Justice summed up for poisoning by strychnine. They were his last words on the matter, considered, temperate, and purposely ambiguous. They neither denied nor confirmed his guilt, but suggested intriguingly that Cook died by some other cause. His wife had probably died of antimony poisoning, and Cook's earlier suffering may have been caused by this too. We can never know, and in any case, the symptoms suffered by Cook immediately prior to his death were manifestly those of strychnine poisoning. If the coup de grace relied on some other poison, then it is merely a technicality. When told that her son had died, his mother, Sarah, said, "They hanged my saintly Billy."